Hi, I'm Doug Sicker. I'm the co-director of the IRLE and also a professor in computer science. Today, I'd like to talk to you about how the internet is doing during this time of the COVID pandemic. I'm not going to get into details with equations or show any graphs or charts. It's just not necessary for the discussion I'd like to have. In future videos, I'm going to dig in much more deeply and show what's happening on the network and where, and maybe some of the concerns that that might mean from a bigger perspective. But today, I just want to really talk about what this transition from working uh, at home and working uh, in much more intense during the day and during the night and during weekends, as well as kids being in school from home, and what this means for the network. What we've seen is we've been asked many times, will the internet break? And of course not. But the question is where might we see some strains? And that's a really interesting area and something that many of us have been looking at in a lot of detail over the last 6 months. So, like any of these technical questions, the answer really depends on the detail. We have seen this population shift, this working from home and schooling from home occur. And we never expected there to be catastrophic failures, but we did anticipate that some weaknesses in the network would show up. And we also were concerned there might be some rippling effects of things happening. Luckily, there hasn't. For the most part, the network has remained very resilient. We've seen some increase load and some increase latency, but for the most part, the network has been able to shift. And this isn't really surprising because if you think about how the network was designed, which is this idea of a network of networks and very highly interconnected and really able to by design to deal with this shift, we did not expect that the network was going to fall apart. In fact, we see these shifts happen all the time as people transition from their work and school day to their time at home. We see the load on the network shift and substantially. Now, that doesn't mean that that's really representative of what we saw occur with COVID, because actually the numbers were greater. But we knew that we had this ability to kind of deal with this transition. And the other thing that we worried about, which I'm going to talk about in a future video, is the implication of cyber attacks. What might have happened and what was going to happen and what has happened. I'm going to have a whole separate video on that because it's interesting. We have seen an increase in cyber attacks at all levels across the U.S. And there's a lot of implication what that might mean in the long run as to what we will need to do to tighten up the network. But as I said, I'm putting that in a separate bucket. Today, I just want to really talk about what we saw across the different segments of the internet. And when we think about that, the internet is really made up of these various parts, and they all work in a complementary way with one another. We're very familiar with the last mile provider. These are the broadband providers that we get our broadband access at different rates from. Very important part of the internet, obviously. There's also the backbone providers and a variety of interconnection and inter-exchange points. This is kind of the core of the network, how packets are routed across the internet from clients and servers that are communicating. We've also seen, obviously, really over the last 10, 15 years, a growth in different other components that weren't there in the early internet, such as content distribution networks. This is where you were able to store content more closely to the customer and to alleviate some of the delays and load that might be otherwise exhibited. We also moved to much more of a cloud-based provider where we have a lot of computing and storage occurring in the internet. And we were accessing these services. Many of the things that we've been depending on, whether that be Zoom or other things, are all integrated into cloud-based infrastructure. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And of course, then we have the applications and the content itself sitting on servers. And that could be Netflix or any other number of things that we use across the internet. Um, so here's what's happened on the internet in the US. We've seen increases in the daily peaks, um, both in the last mile as well as in the backbone. So that means we've seen more traffic on the internet and longer, so more persistent, longer peaks. Not surprising. A lot of things that were happening in person are now happening online. So of course we're going to see this kind of um, proportional shift and increase. Um, but even with that, the network has remained very resilient and very well operating. We've seen a significant increase in the last mile traffic, both in the upstream direction, that means from to the home into the internet, as well as the downstream towards the home. These have been in the 15 to 35% increases, and luckily those are within the margin, the design of the network and the design of these access technologies. So we're not seeing a lot of problems as a result. Excuse me. We've also seen an increase in the time it takes for downloads to occur or communication to occur. So download and upload speeds have increased as well. When I mean speeds, I should say the delay on these downloads. And again, not surprising given the load. The good thing here is that these delays are only in the few percentages, so fractions of a second, and nothing that you or I would generally be able to even notice in our daily communication. This tends to be taken care of within the network or at the endpoints through buffering and other sorts of technologies. So both that increase in the traffic demand as well as the proportional latency increase has happened, but again, not in a way that's really had a severe impact. Now, of course, that's not to say that things haven't gone wrong. We've seen some cloud infrastructure providers have limited capacity, and we've also seen some conferencing tools and other things need to grow their capacity in very quick order. And of course, that has been, involves time. Luckily, they've been able to make a lot of these changes in ways that wouldn't have been able to be done in the past. And that's really because we've moved to this much more agile software design of the network. And we've seen the ability for internet infrastructure to be added in when the capacity is needed. So we've seen this kind of growth happen very quickly in response, but of course it's a lag. So there are some providers and some applications that have suffered a little bit, but really this is at the edge of the network, not really the network itself. And as I said, this has been dealt with by increasing the capacity at that edge. So not something to be surprised about, but again, the good news is that while there has been some problems, they were quickly remedied. Now, it's clear that this kind of overall load on the network has been something that's been a bit of an experiment. Nobody actually knew specifically what was going to happen. Many of us thought that there would be some set of outages, some set of concerns about last mile infrastructure access for existing subscribers, but we've seen very little of that. We've seen some people decide to increase their data rates, the download speed, so to speak, or the service package they buy from their ISP. But that's, again, really a matter of sizing the network properly from your own use. So if you're going to be using the network constantly, you can't have a small broadband access provider package. You need to have something that's much bigger. so that you can deal with that capacity. Um, and this brings me really to where I want to end. Um, I would say the most concerning note through this whole thing hasn't been about the failures in the network that we have. It's really been about the failures where we don't have the network. And what I mean by that is that there are citizens out there who don't have broadband connectivity that's either accessible or affordable. And many of these are kids who are trying to do their schoolwork. And we've seen pictures of kids getting near their schools or hanging out outside of libraries or other public or open access Wi-Fi access points. And that's really an issue that I think probably needs more attention. Um, we're going to probably see a significant shift in public policy over the next 6 months to really think about how do we make sure that we provide this capability for everyone, given the need that the pandemic has shown for us. So with that, I want to tell you that I'll come back with some much more detailed videos with diagrams and charts and a lot more detail in terms of what's happening from a security perspective, but also a lot more insight into what this might mean from a public policy perspective. So thanks for listening, and please be safe.